I have but a little neck. She says it laughing. Hands wrapped around her own throat, like it's a joke between friends. It isn't a joke. It's the 18th of May, 1536. The woman saying it is Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, mother of the future Elizabeth I, the woman who broke a church in two just to marry the man who now wants her dead. She has less than a day left to live. And she is joking about the size of her own neck to the man guarding her. Here's what's actually happening in London tonight, while she laughs. A swordsman is sharpening a blade that doesn't exist anywhere else in England, because no Englishman has ever been asked to do what he's about to do to a queen. And across that same city, the king she married for love is already making arrangements to marry someone else. So the question isn't just how Anne Boleyn died. You probably already know that part. The real question is this: in her final hours, alone in a fortress with the truth just out of reach, how much of it did she actually see coming? Stick around. It's not what you think. To understand what Anne Boleyn knows on this last night, you have to understand what she built. The fall only makes sense against the height of it. 10 years earlier, she's nobody's queen. She spends much of her adolescence at the French court, and it changes her completely. She comes back reading French poetry, debating theology at a time when that alone could get a woman labeled dangerous, holding her own in rooms full of men who'd rather she stayed quiet. People who hated her still admitted she was one of the sharpest conversationalists at court. That reputation follows her home. And Henry VIII notices. He's been married for over 2 decades to Catherine of Aragon. He wants Anne, not as a mistress. He'd had those already, including, uncomfortably, Anne's own sister Mary. He wants Anne as a wife. Anne makes him wait for it. 6 years of refusing to play the mistress role, betting everything on the idea that she's worth more than that. That wait breaks the world. Literally. From 1527 to 1533, Henry fights what history calls the King's Great Matter, his attempt to annul the marriage to Catherine so he can marry Anne instead. This is not paperwork. Catherine is the daughter of Spanish monarchs. She's aunt to the most powerful ruler in Europe. And she is devoutly, permanently certain her marriage is valid in God's eyes. She says no. For 6 years, she says no. Henry's chief minister, Cardinal Wolsey, spends years trying to negotiate an annulment through Rome. He fails. The Pope, leaned on by Catherine's nephew, won't budge. So Wolsey pays for it with everything he has, stripped of power, arrested for treason, dead on the road to his own trial in 1530. And watches all of it. Up close. She watches a cardinal fall. She watches a king get more radical, more impatient, more willing to break precedent with every passing year. And eventually Henry stops waiting for Rome's permission entirely. In 1534 he simply removes England from Rome's authority, makes himself supreme head of a brand new Church of England, for the sole practical purpose of granting himself the marriage the old church wouldn't. Catherine gets exiled. Stripped of the title of queen. She dies in early 1536, separated from her own daughter, still insisting to the end that she's Henry's rightful wife. Her last letter reportedly calls him, "my most dear lord, king, and husband." Men die for this too. Thomas More, once Henry's own Lord Chancellor, goes to the block in 1535 for refusing to swear the oath recognizing the new marriage and the new church. All of it, in the end, for Anne. So here's the machine Anne Boleyn marries into, a king who already proved, once, that he'd tear down the oldest religious authority in Europe rather than accept no, and who already proved he'd execute his closest allies to get there. Keep that in your back pocket. It matters later. She becomes queen in 1533. Gives England a daughter, Elizabeth, not the son Henry needed, which mattered more in this world than we'd like to admit, but a start. For a while, Anne Boleyn is the most powerful woman in England. A queen built entirely out of one man's obsession. Which also makes her the most fragile thing in England. A throne built on desire can be dismantled the exact same way desire built it. By 1536, that desire has curdled. Henry's eye moves on, to a quiet, unthreatening lady of the court named Jane Seymour. And loses a son in miscarriage that January, on the very day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral. Something in Henry dies with it too. The king who once wrote her aching love letters barely looks at her now. Then, in the last week of April 1536, everything speeds up. A court musician named Mark Smeaton is arrested. After questioning, quite possibly torture, he confesses to sleeping with the Queen. Within days, 4 more men get named. Courtiers, friends, and, almost unthinkably, Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. The charges: adultery, incest, conspiring to murder the king. Here's the part that makes the timeline genuinely uncomfortable. Jane Seymour isn't a surprise who shows up after the arrest. She's already there. Already visible. Weeks before any of this starts. By early 1536, Jane, a quiet lady of Anne's own household, everything Anne herself is not, is already receiving the king's attention openly enough that people at court are gossiping. Her brothers move fast, coaching her to look modest and virtuous, the deliberate opposite of everything Anne stands accused of. At one point Henry sends her money and a love letter. She sends the money back unopened, tells him to wait until he can offer marriage. Sound familiar? It's almost exactly the strategy Anne used on Henry a decade earlier. Anne isn't just losing her husband to a stranger. She's watching a woman run her own old playbook against her, inside her own household, while she's still queen. If Anne understood anything with total clarity in her final weeks, it's this: she didn't need Cromwell's fabricated evidence to see what was coming. She'd lived this exact shape before. She'd just been on the other side of it. On the 2nd of May, she's arrested. Taken by barge to the Tower of London, the same fortress where, 3 years earlier, she'd stayed the night before her own coronation, dressed in white and gold, cheered by the same city about to watch her die. Same building. Opposite story. Here's the part almost nobody expects. A woman locked in the tower, awaiting a treason trial, does not stop talking. She talks constantly, to her ladies, to the guards, and most importantly, to Sir William Kingston, Constable of the Tower. Kingston writes almost all of it down, sends it straight to the man orchestrating her downfall, Thomas Cromwell. Which means we have something extraordinary. We have Anne Boleyn's own words, from her own captivity, filtered through the pen of the very machine trying to destroy her. She swings, in these letters, between sharp clarity and something closer to shock. At one point she asks Kingston, with real bewilderment, "Shall I die without justice?" At another she laughs and says the king has done this to prove her. To prove her. As if this might still, somehow, be a test. Think about that for a second. This is a woman who watched Henry VIII dismantle a church to marry her. She knows exactly what he's capable of building. Does she really believe, even now, that he's capable of building it, just to see if she survives? Or is that hope? Genuine, desperate hope, keeping her upright when nothing else can? We don't know. And the not knowing is the real story here. Before there's a trial, there has to be a case. And this one, when you actually look closely, is one of the strangest pieces of legal engineering in English history. It starts with Cromwell. Not out of moral conviction. Out of necessity. By early 1536, Cromwell believes and is working to destroy him. She opposed how he was spending money seized from dissolved monasteries. She'd made it known she wanted him gone. In a court built entirely on patronage and survival, that makes her a threat he can't ignore. He later all but admits, in private letters, that he engineered her downfall himself, not because Henry asked first, but because his own position demanded it. Now watch the evidence fall apart. The indictment names specific days and specific locations where Anne supposedly committed adultery with 5 different men, including her own brother. Check those dates against the actual royal itinerary, and the case collapses. On several of the listed dates, court records show Anne recovering from childbirth. On others, the king's own travel logs put the court somewhere else entirely. Not just unlikely. Impossible. None of that matters at the time. Mark Smeaton is the only accused man who ever confesses, and only after being taken to Cromwell's private home in Stepney, rather than a normal prison, under circumstances even contemporaries found suspicious. Every other man arrested, including George Boleyn, denies everything, consistently, all the way to the scaffold. Impossible dates. One coerced confession. That's the entire case waiting for Anne at trial. On the 15th of May, Anne is tried inside the Tower itself, in the King's Hall, before 26 peers, including, in one of history's crueler ironies, her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presiding as Lord High Steward. The evidence is, by any honest standard, almost nothing. Vague dates. One coerced confession. Rumor dressed up as testimony. Her brother George is tried the same day, and in a moment of reckless, doomed defiance, reads aloud in open court a piece of evidence he was only supposed to silently confirm, evidence suggesting the king himself was sexually inadequate. A man who knows he's already dead, deciding to make the room as uncomfortable as the truth deserves. It doesn't matter. The verdict was written before the trial began. Guilty. Sentence, death, by burning or beheading, at the king's pleasure. Here's the detail that should stop you cold. The king's mercy, when it finally arrives, isn't a pardon. It's a method. Henry decides and will be beheaded, not burned. And he does something stranger. He sends to Calais for a swordsman. Not an axe. A sword. English executions use an axe, and axes are not gentle. They frequently take more than one blow to finish the job. A sword, in a trained hand, is fast, one stroke, if the executioner is skilled and the condemned holds still. So somewhere in the days before her death, a message crosses the channel to hire what amounts to the most humane executioner available in Europe. Henry VIII, the same man who just destroyed her with a trial built on fiction, arranges for her to die well. What do you do with a fact like that? Mercy? Guilt? Or just a king protecting his own image, making sure his queen dies with the dignity befitting someone he once loved enough to break a country over? Anne is told about the sword. She reportedly says it means she'll feel no pain, it is so subtle. Whether that steadies her, or just gives her one more thing to turn over quietly in the dark, we can only guess. Before we get to Anne's last night, there's a detail most tellings of this story skip right past. It might be the single most important thing she carries into that final night. On the 17th of May, 2 days before Anne dies, her brother George is beheaded on Tower Hill, alongside Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston. George goes first. Witnesses describe him climbing the scaffold with composure, delivering the expected speech, careful, like his sister will be 2 days later, never to actually confess to a crime he almost certainly didn't commit. Tower Hill sits a 5-minute walk from Anne's rooms. Some historians think she can hear the crowd. Whether she catches anything specific from that distance is unknowable. But she doesn't need to. She knows, to the hour, when it happens. Kingston has no reason, and no permission, to hide it from her. So by the time we reach Anne's final night, the laughter, the talk of the very good executioner, the little neck, she isn't approaching death in the abstract. She's already spent a full day and night knowing, with total certainty, that her own brother is dead, for a crime invented to justify killing her too. That reframes the joke, doesn't it? It isn't naivety. It's a woman who's already watched the machine take someone she loves, doing the only thing left available to her. Refusing to let it see her break before it's her turn. The execution is set for the 18th of May. Anne prepares. Makes her final confession. Receives the sacrament, and here's a detail later historians treat almost like forensic evidence. She swears, on the body of Christ, in front of witnesses, that she's innocent of the charges. Twice. In the theology of her time, that's not small. Lying while taking the sacrament damns your own soul. A woman staring at execution has nothing left to gain by lying to God. And then the execution doesn't happen. The swordsman from Calais hasn't arrived. Or the crowds gathering at the tower need to be dispersed and the site resecured for the next day. Accounts differ on the exact reason. The result is the same either way, and, fully prepared to die, having said her final prayers and made her peace, is told to wait. One more night. Sit inside that for a second. You've steadied yourself for death. You've confessed. You've sworn your innocence to God with what you believed was your last honest breath. And someone opens the door and tells you, not today. Kingston reports she takes the news not with terror, but almost relief, telling him she's sorry, because she thought she'd be past her pain by now, dead by 12 o'clock. Then, in the same breath, she's heard the executioner is very good, and she has the little neck, hands around her own throat. Laughing. Historians still argue about that laugh. Courage? Shock? A mind protecting itself from a horror too big to hold directly, so it slips sideways into dark comedy instead? We don't get to know for certain. And that uncertainty is, in a strange way, the most honest thing left of Anne Boleyn, a woman who spent her whole life being interpreted by other people, right up to her very last recorded words. The morning of the 19th of May, 1536, is clear. Anne wakes in the Queen's lodgings, the same rooms she occupied, radiant, 3 years earlier, the night before her coronation. Same stone. Same view. A completely different life waiting outside the window. She dresses with care. Not vanity, control. Quite possibly the last decision she'll ever get to make for herself, and she makes it deliberately. Dark grey damask over a crimson kirtle, ermine at her shoulders, dark hair gathered up beneath a plain white cap. Away from her neck. She's thought about this. Of course she has. The walk from her lodgings to the scaffold is short, a few hundred feet across the inner ward. But it's made slowly, in front of an audience she knows intimately, guards she's spoken with for over 2 weeks, officials she once outranked, faces she'd recognize from her own coronation procession, standing now to watch the opposite ceremony. Two of her ladies walk beside her, visibly struggling to hold their composure. Anne, according to Kingston, does not struggle. She turns several times to comfort them. Even walking toward her own death, she's managing the room. At around 8 in the morning, she's led out, not to the public execution ground on Tower Hill, but to a private scaffold on Tower Green, inside the fortress walls. Another small mercy. Another decision made somewhere above her, for reasons she'll never fully know. Roughly 1,000 people gather to watch. Courtiers. Officials. Ordinary Londoners who talk their way inside. Thomas Cromwell is there. So is the man who'll become the new Chancellor within weeks. Henry VIII is not there. He's reportedly at Whitehall, waiting for the news, some accounts say already dressed to visit Jane Seymour the moment word arrives. And climbs the scaffold steps. And here, right here, is the moment that defines everything we still don't know about her. She's given the chance to speak. Convention dictates what a condemned person says in this moment: praise the king, accept the sentence, ask for prayers. It's a script. Nearly everyone follows it, because deviation could mean retribution against whoever they leave behind. And follows it too. Almost. She says, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, according to law, for by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." Listen to that again. According to law. By the law I am judged. Not I am guilty. Not I deserved this. She says exactly what the moment requires, and structures it so carefully she never once actually confesses to the crimes killing her. She goes on. Asks the crowd to pray for the king, calls him one of the best princes on the face of the earth, and asks that if anyone should meddle in my cause, they judge the best of it. That last line isn't obedience. It's a coded message for history, wrapped in just enough submission to survive one more day in the ears of the men listening. Then she kneels. Her ladies, devastated, almost too undone to help, remove her mantle, adjust her headdress, tuck her hair under a plain linen cap so nothing obstructs the blade. She's blindfolded. No block. Unlike a typical English beheading, the French-style sword execution requires the condemned to simply kneel, still, with nothing to rest against. Total trust that death comes quickly, from a direction you can't see, at a moment you can't predict. Witnesses say she prays, repeating, over and over, "To Christ I commend my soul, Jesus receive my soul." A woman narrating her own final seconds, because the alternative is silence, and silence leaves too much room for fear. The swordsman calls out to an assistant to fetch the sword. A deliberate misdirection, so Anne, kneeling, blind, trusting, won't tense in anticipation. It works. In that half-second of relaxed uncertainty, he swings. One stroke. Exactly as fast and clean as promised. The mercy Henry ordered, delivered precisely as designed. Anne Boleyn, queen, gambler, reformer, mother, the woman who broke the oldest institution in England just by being wanted, is gone. Here's the detail that tends to stop people cold: there's no coffin. And body and severed head are wrapped and placed into an old elm arrow chest, the closest thing available inside the tower, and buried, without ceremony, beneath the floor of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, steps from where she died. A woman who once wore the crown of England, put in the ground in a box meant for weapons. 11 days later, on the 30th of May, 1536, Henry VIII marries Jane Seymour. 11 days. Read that again. That timeline alone tells you how prepared this ending already was before Anne even reached her trial. The machinery of her replacement wasn't improvised in grief. It was waiting. So, back to the video's real question. What did Anne actually know, that last night, about all of this? Historians are genuinely split. Let's give you the honest range, not one tidy answer. Eric Ives, whose biography of Anne is generally considered the standard scholarly account, argues she was the victim of a deliberate, cynical political coup, that Cromwell built the case knowing full well it was fiction, and Anne herself understood exactly what was happening well before her arrest. Under this reading, everything she says and does in the Tower is calculated, a woman managing her legacy and her daughter's future with the same political sharpness that got her the crown in the first place. Retha Warnick offers something stranger, that the accusations, however false in detail, grew out of genuine court panic around Anne's January miscarriage, in an era when a failed pregnancy could be read as evidence of sin or witchcraft. Under this reading, at least some of the men prosecuting her may have half believed it. Less coldly calculated. More chaotically, dangerously sincere. G.W. Bernard goes further than almost any serious historian, arguing the charges might not be entirely fabricated at all, a position most Boleyn scholars reject, but one that keeps this a genuinely unsettled argument, not a closed case. So, what actually holds up? One camp says Anne understood almost everything. She was politically sharp, arguably one of the sharpest minds at Henry's court. By late April, she'd have understood the charges were fabricated theatre, that Cromwell built a case from nothing because he needed her gone, and that Henry, whatever guilt lived in him, was choosing to believe it because believing it was convenient. Under this reading, her scaffold speech isn't naive obedience. It's the last political maneuver of a very political woman, protecting her daughter with careful, coded language, right to the end. The other camp says the opposite, that Anne, even in the Tower, couldn't fully process what was happening, because it had no precedent. No Queen of England had ever been executed. There was no script in her head for this. Under this reading, the swings between defiance and disbelief in Kingston's letters, the laughter, the talk of proving her, the shock at the delay, aren't performance. They're the real, unfiltered sound of a mind trying and failing to hold something too large and too fast to comprehend. But press on the evidence, and one reading holds up better. A woman who genuinely believed she might be spared doesn't build a scaffold speech around "if anyone should meddle in my cause, I require them to judge the best." That's not hope. That's someone leaving instructions. A woman still clinging to disbelief doesn't swear her innocence twice, under oath, at the exact moment lying would carry the highest possible stakes for her soul. And a woman who hadn't already made peace with her situation doesn't watch her own brother die 2 days early and still find the composure to joke with her jailer the next night. The evidence points to a woman who knew. Who understood, with total clarity, exactly what was being done to her and why, and who spent her final hours not in denial, but in construction. Carefully building the version of her death that would protect her daughter, her family name, and her own soul, in that order. The laughter wasn't confusion. It was discipline. What she couldn't have known, what none of us ever get to know, standing inside our own worst night, is what any of it would eventually mean. 3 years after her death, the marriage that started all of this, that broke a church, exiled a queen, executed a queen, produces its lasting legacy anyway. Anne's daughter Elizabeth grows up in the shadow of a mother she's forbidden to speak of. For years, she's legally declared illegitimate, stripped of her place in the succession, raised in a court where the safest move is pretending her mother never existed at all. She doesn't pretend for long once she has the power not to. When Elizabeth finally becomes queen in 1558, she quietly restores her mother's family where she can, reinstating Boleyn relatives to influence, wearing a ring later discovered to hide a portrait of and beside her own. She adopts her mother's personal badge, the white falcon, as one of her own royal symbols. She never marries, never fully explains why. Historians have spent centuries wondering how much of that choice traces back to watching, even as a child too young to understand it, what happened to women who tied their entire fate to a king's affection. Elizabeth becomes Elizabeth I, one of the most consequential monarchs in English history. The ruler of the Golden Age, the queen who defeats the Spanish Armada, presides over Shakespeare's England, a 50-year reign built, in no small part, on a lesson her mother's death seems to have taught her before she could even read. Everything Henry tore down to have Anne, and then tore down again to be rid of her, becomes the foundation his daughter, her daughter, eventually stands on to build something that outlasts him by centuries. Anne never gets to see any of it. On her last night, alone in a fortress, joking darkly about the size of her own neck, she has no way of knowing the child she'd leave behind would become the reason anyone still remembers her name at all. Maybe that's the part of this story that lingers longest. Not the trial. Not even the sword. A woman who understood exactly what was being done to her, and chose, with her very last hours, to spend them building something instead of breaking. A legacy. A defense. A version of the truth that would outlast the men trying to erase it. She just never got to see whether it worked. We spend our endings certain we understand the whole shape of our story. Usually, we're only holding one small, dark piece of it, and we rarely live long enough to see how the rest gets written. If this kind of history, the kind that sits right at the edge of philosophy, is the kind of story you want more of, the rest of the endless arc is right there waiting for you.